Kenny Goodman here from findtheedge.com. If you're an entrepreneur or a business leader and you've been involved in an acquisition or a merger, you will know that it's not plain sailing. All sorts of issues can come up, whether you're selling your business or if you're acquiring a business, because there's usually some level of a clash of cultures. And also, as we've mentioned before, it's very, very important to make sure that you manage the knowledge within the company. Now, if there's an acquisition or a merger going on, this can get very, very sticky. And today we're lucky enough to get Paul Corney back to do part 2 of his interview, which is going to be focused specifically on mergers and acquisitions. So, hello Paul, and welcome back.
Kenny, hi.
So thank you very much for coming back in and chatting with us before such an important trip ahead of you. So today what I wanted to talk about, which we didn't really have time for last time, was what happens when two companies come together, so either through acquisition or through merger. What experiences have you had in that?
Fascinating experiences, actually. Some of you will probably remember the dot-com era, and I was particularly privileged at the time to be on the board of a company who was at the start of the dot-com era, making, at the time, horizontal knowledge management software. It went on to become, strangely enough, one of 3i's best performing investments. But the challenge of being asked to sit on the board at the time, or as an advisor, was that we were on an acquisition trail, and the acquisitions were quite amazing because we were a Guildford-based company, and we were brought together with a Dutch company. We then acquired a company in the US, which was very prominent in our industry and has something quite similar like this, an expert network. And we then, as a combined group, acquired a company in Germany, Aventis IT's company. And finally, we then bought another company in Scotland. So in a way, that's quite a lot of experience. Should I elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, because it sounds really interesting, because you've got all of these different cultures and somehow you've got to bring them together.
Okay, well, the big challenge at the time was, how could you create a culture that reflected all of the different aspects of the business, but at the same time got the business underway? The policy that the chairman had, which I thought was wonderful, was he used to meet prospective acquirees, if you like, on a Sunday afternoon for lunch. And if things went well, I'd be sort of waiting in an ante room to join them to talk through with the CEO and the COO about our integration plan. And here was the first key thing for me. We drew up an integration plan on the basis that if you didn't get integration right in the first 90 days, it's a bit like an intranet redesign, something like that. If you didn't get that right in the first 90 days and make tangible impact, nothing would happen. So we had a quite prescriptive integration plan, which meant bringing the technologies together as underpinnings, but also making it easy for people to know who they were dealing with across the organization, what the individual roles were doing. And as a knowledge management software business at the time, we were, if you like, eating our own dog food. Now, the other thing that we did, and whether budgets would allow that in the world we live in today, but the other thing we did was we used to hold fairly regular integration events. And they were about what was it like working as a team, and how would you produce development teams across the whole of the world, if you like, our world, which stretched west from Frankfurt all the way across to Denver. So we had different time zones and we had different ways of communicating. And it was hugely important that we had a common understanding of what it was we were trying to achieve. And I can always remember one of the biggest examples was an event we held in a place called Scheveningen in the Netherlands, where we brought all of the various teams together. And we had a weekend of events, some of which were fairly light-hearted, but but they were done in teams, and the intention was to demonstrate the value of working across culture and across team. One of the examples was running a puppet show, and you saw the creativity of different people. And I should always remember we put the management team together as a separate unit, and at the final analysis, people had to present their results to a panel, and the panel decided whether or not they were allocated a brick. And the brick became a wall, which was a symbol of the way the organisation would come together. So there was a missing brick, which was brick 52, because people hadn't cooperated. But it was like the pivotal thing. It was that brick became the intranet symbol, brick 52. That's the way the organisation needed to come together.
And is that what you called it? The intranet?
Yeah, brick 52. So these integration events were a good underpinning. The other thing that was really important for me was the degree of transparency, and the managing director who I worked with was very keen on this, because when you're dealing with people being taken on from all sorts of different walks of life and different cultures, the culture in Germany is very different. People require a consensus. The humour is very different in different countries. American humour is, strangely enough, quite closer to Dutch humour than it is to British humour. Mm-hmm. And so we said things and did things. They were huge. They had to be in a way that would be interpreted the right way by everybody. Another stunning example really was the use of email. One culture always acknowledged, another culture never did. So it cost us a fair bit of money in the early days realizing this, because people got very upset when their responses weren't acknowledged.
Yeah.
So little things like that you have to be on top of, and the organisation that misses those. I shall never forget, I had to give a speech once in Frankfurt, and I was having dinner afterwards with a gentleman who was in charge of the merger between BMW and Rover. And one of the things he said to me was, at the time, it was really instructive, because he said, you know, we did a lot of things where we encouraged people to see videos of how other people saw each other's culture. And he said, but what happened in the end was we were all frightened of offending each other. So actually, it took a lot of time. You know, there was a perception of people rushing down to the holiday sunbed with their towel. You know, and they lightheartedly played these back, but they actually ended up creating a very neutral culture, which wasn't conducive to innovation.
Yeah. So when these companies are on acquisition trails, or aggressively acquiring, which we saw in the last decade, we've not seen it so much since the big recession and stuff. But what is going through their mind? What's going through the CEO's mind? Is it just let's acquire them and swallow them up into us, or do they really think about the integration of the employees?
Both.
Right.
I think the world we live in today is moving into a slightly different aspect. A colleague and I used to do a lot of work for a venture capital group, quite a prominent venture capital investor. And one of the things that we used to get asked to do was to go to organizations and assess the management team and the staff from both a new product development perspective, an information technology perspective, but also a management perspective. How does the organization work as a business? And that was really, really insightful, because very often part of their value judgment was, were the management going to be able to take this business on? And thus, could they see themselves working with that management? It's a bit like buying software. One of the first questions, or you get somebody in to build something for you, one of the first questions that you ask, which is sort of under the intangible, is, can we work with these people?
Yeah, absolutely. Slightly off subject, but I remember watching an interview with Warren Buffett's right-hand man, and he was saying when they look at companies, they look a little bit deeper than some of the other investors out there. Instead of just looking at the data, they look at the integrity of the management team there as well.
The other thing, Kelly, I'll tell you one other thing that we used to do, and this sounds a bit cloak and daggerish, but it wasn't. You know, if you're paying, say, in one case they were paying something like 35 million for a business, and this company was under the cosh to deliver on something, and we actually went there early. We did a car park test.
Right. Okay. What's that?
You know, how many cars were in the car park at 7 o'clock in the morning?
Right. Okay.
How many people were there at 6 o'clock in the evening?
Yeah.
If you have a shared sense of purpose, you know, there's another thing that just going back to this integration thing, we shifted in the software days. We shifted our development center across to Denver. And one of the biggest things that we did as an organization was we gave the developers a CD budget, which wouldn't be relevant today, but at the time it was. And we said, you know, you go and buy CDs if you think that's what you want to do. And we worked on results. So if somebody wanted to work all night, that was up to them.
Yeah.
We created the environment, and that would be very different across the whole organization.
Yeah.
So different people require different levels of interaction, but it's part of coming together as a culture that says it's a culture around results and general satisfaction around results. Let me share with you one other thing that I did a piece of work which I can't name, unfortunately, but what was instructive was the gentleman who was in charge was asking people to take cuts just about the same time as he got a new Porsche.
Oh, yeah. My sister-in-law was working at a company once where they had just made lots of redundancies, and the CEO of the company came in a brand new flash motor as well on the same day, and you know, it just sends out such a bad message.
Well, I think it plays back to your comment earlier on about where you asked me the question about were people thinking about things. I think my feeling is yes, they are. I think the days of people just acquiring and then firing instantly has long since gone. I think people are more receptive because of the adverse publicity and the need for culture for people to be showing integrity in a way that perhaps has disappeared in the last 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Because now with social media as well, these employees aren't as silent as they used to be as well.
Correct. You know, you only have to look at the classic cases of, you know, Don't Mess with Granny Annie and the United Breaks guitars to realise the damage that can be done by just dismissively sort of talking to people or ignoring them. You can no longer ignore them. There was something else that struck me when you were talking about pulling people together, and it's something I would share with you. This was around the cultural alignment issue. It was how could you create a culture that reflected this can-do attitude across the organisation, and that was done by working parties that encompassed everybody from all different centres. And everybody had the right to say, well, actually, what do you want the culture to be? You know, is it an inspirational one where people tolerate or do not tolerate poor performance? And I went through some psychometrics work with people and the heads that I had in the various centres of the organisation. And we came up with a few PowerPoints, believe it or not, with pictures that really described what we thought the culture of the organisation should be and what people wanted it to be. They wanted to hear the news. They didn't want it to be sort of dressed up. So when there was a period of downsizing, which was inevitable after the end of the dot-com era, people wouldn't be happy, but they at least understood that there was an openness and people were going to be communicated as to why it was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever seen any desperately bad mergers?
Well, they say that something like 80% of mergers fail, don't they?
Oh, I didn't know that. That's a big figure.
It's an amazing statistic about how many fail. And And you know, and I think it's wrong to throw mud at people. Everybody has their own reasons and rationale for doing it. The organisations, the big thing is at what point do you drop brand? In some ways, I mean, how do you come together as an aligned brand? If you think of all the examples over the years where two big organisations get together, what do they call themselves? Do they end up becoming an amalgam of 3 or 4 names that no one can identify with, or do they suddenly become everything everywhere, for example?
Yeah. It's a good example.
Well, it sort of feels it's important. There's something else that was triggered by the conversation we had the other day, which plays on, and I thought might be useful to share. One of the experiences that I've tried to set up in various organisations I've worked with over the years about communication, which underpins this whole idea of cultural underpinning, and it played to a large extent in the work I did in the city with the organisation, the city reinsurance broker, that came together as a group of different businesses. We tried coffee sessions, and this was something that was tried out at the Zurich in the late 90s, early 2000s. And one of the aspects of that was we had 8 people from different parts of the organisation who would go around the 8 executives once a month, and they'd have coffee with them. They'd have a coffee hour, and nothing was off agenda.
Right, so they could bring anything up.
Yeah, and it did 2 things. It created, if you like, embryonic little communities, because you had like these little communities where you broke down the barriers. So you had people from different levels of the organisation, from different parts of the organisation, and you then created almost like ambassadors.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you had the ability to communicate with a whole raft of different people that you would never have normally done.
Yeah.
And to some extent, people do that today, but they do it more by social media than by sort of physical movement. It works when you have people within the same sort of geographical location, not necessarily the same building. But the executives found it quite difficult at first, but once they got used to the fact that they were willing to be open, it transformed them. And that was a huge difference. The other thing that I think I may have shared with you in the past was an experience that we found particularly useful in the .com company, which was to pull everybody together around the whole world, from our world, once a quarter, for like a briefing from the board and the chief executive. And one of the ways we facilitated that was we had a set of questions. Anybody could post a question anonymous to me. I wouldn't disclose to the executive who posed the question, but we had about 15 minutes on a 30-minute conference call. At the time, video probably wouldn't have hacked it, but the conference call was conducted about 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the UK, which meant all the time zones could be covered, and the rule was everybody had to be eating something. So we all had to. There was always a joke about the different aspects of food, because food is key to conversation. Yeah. So we had food, we had conversation. And we had the most amazing set of exchanges where one of the senior management would talk about their business aspect, the chief executive would give a briefing, then the chairman, and then I just asked them questions that had been posed by members of the staff.
Yeah.
And that was really useful, especially again at a time when things were getting difficult.
So when you talk about mergers, for example, and knowledge, how do you keep the knowledge from all the different companies without them losing their brand, their awareness of themselves? How do you do that? Because surely the company that's acquiring these companies most of the time wants to kind of suck up the brand and make it their own brand.
Great question. Yes and yes. The typical answer really is that there is no one size fits all for this. Right. It really depends on why you've acquired somebody. Is it for people? Is it for their reputation? Is it for the sort of the way that the organisation works. Very often, the processes organisations have are actually as important as the brand itself,
Yeah.
because it's their innovative culture that makes things happen. How often do businesses get bought? The leaders have a lockdown clause, and then at the end of that, they clear off straight away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so my experience, one of the things that we've found over the years, and we sounds like the royal we, but when I've worked with different consultancies and different people, is the ability to create what we call a future story. And one of my colleagues at Spark at the time, Spark now, I can't tell you the organisation, but one of the ways it was done was to create a future story of the two businesses together.
Yeah.
And so you create a macro, a meta, if you like, a macro story that is the organisation working at, and then you have a set of like micro stories, which is how does it work in different organisations working forward. And that again, there's a lot of research been done on that. I've used postcards a fair bit to get people to write postcards back from the future.
Right. Okay.
And where it's 20, and I'm going to use this technique in Sudan, where it's 2020. Here's what the world is looking like. Here's what technology is looking like. Assuming that's the case, what do you think you, as a persona, as a person, one of them's going to be Abdul Karim the doctor. What are you, Abdul Karim, as a doctor? What are you going to be doing in 2020? What's the day in the life of Abdul Karim look like? And then you do backcasting to come back and say, okay, what are the events that will get you there to that? Why do you do that? Simple. You actually take people out of their comfort zone and out of the sort of the known areas, if you like, of insularity that they deal in. I think it's what Geoffrey Boycott calls in a cricket term a corridor of uncertainty. And to take people out of that sort of environment, and you give them the opportunity of thinking sort of fairly laterally about what the world might look like.
Yeah, very powerful.
And that future story aspect is something that's playing extremely well. When you're trying to communicate with people about future vision.
Yeah, I bet. So, just to round this up, what do you think, Mr. Paul Corney, what difference could you make with a merger or an acquisition?
I think there comes a point with everybody when you say, okay, what do we need? You normally need somebody alongside you who's been there, done it, and got the T-shirt. And also, you probably need someone who's not going to be frightened to say, my job doesn't depend on this.
Yeah, okay.
And that's one of the challenges. How often are integrations managed by people who actually have a vested interest in the outcome?
Yeah.
So my feeling has always been you should never have somebody do that, because it's a bit like the redundancy round, isn't it? The person given the task of doing it is often the last one then to be told, sorry, you're out the door.
Yeah.
So I think you need people working alongside you who know what this is about. And as I say, I think the ability to go beyond the usual communications things and emphasise it. One final story. In Prague a few years back, one of my colleagues and I were giving a presentation, a big event for internal communicators, and one of the people talking there was from a Hungarian cement company, and she was a fascinating lady because she'd had a responsibility of sort of trying to get the organisation together. And she'd actually ended up bringing two organisations together, but she'd created a company cookbook.
Right, okay.
And in the end, everybody came together and did the cooking.
Brilliant. So that
but
brought everyone together.
They're just simple things that you identify the culture, you identify what's going to work best in that culture and how to communicate best.
Yeah.
And then because the language is always the language of the business and the language of people who work in it.
Yeah, I think the thing from talking to you, what I've got is that people are human beings, and if you can bring some normality into the situation and something that they see as their own, and they can bring that to the table, then it kind of helps them to gel with each other.
Well, there's two final thoughts here, if I may. The first one is around space, because people don't tend. If you think about it, organisations, you spend an awful lot of time in the same place.
Yeah.
Unless you're lucky enough, like me, to go off to different parts of the world and work with a lot of different companies. But if you accept that's the case, you're fairly wedded to the environment you're operating in. So you need to make that quite comfortable for the individual, but you also need to make it dynamic. And one of the biggest challenges that organisations face is they often move and they often relocate and they often and a lot of organisations go to open planning.
Yeah.
And there is a huge psychological issue around that. What do people want out of a working environment? So you have to, when you're planning moves, think very, very carefully, because space and knowledge management, we had a water cooler story the other day, but space and knowledge management are intrinsically linked. And you have to create spaces where people can have interchange that are really valuable, but they can do it in a way that's not uncomfortable to them. When one of the organisations I worked with in the city was planning a move, which was a fairly big move because it was a way of integrating all the companies under one roof. One of the first things that we did was to put a young graduate who we trained as a journalist. We put him over into the new building, and he was writing a blog, like a letter from America, if you like. It was actually One America Square, so it was almost a letter from One America Square. But it was a very important thing, because it was like just like the idea of building a bridge, a metaphorical bridge.
Yeah.
And we created a room that was dressed up within the old building exactly as the new environment would look. So all meetings about the new building were held there.
Wow. Just one more question before we go. I interviewed someone called Roger Philby the other day from the chemistry group, and he talks a lot about how he goes into companies and helps them design their recruitment methodologies, and he's quite certain that, you know, values and motivations and that type of thing are more important to whether somebody will fit in with a company than their actual previous experience. So do you find that this can have a big effect on mergers as well, if two sets of employees have totally different sets of values?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
It's the expressives and the analytics, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that debate, and very much so. But then it's you know, partly back to my BMW discussion, wasn't it? BMW Rover. There has to be a mechanism for identifying it, because you actually may want to throw out a lot of the old taboos, if you like. You know, you go back, you think about it, when revenue in this country and customs in this country merged, you couldn't have more different ways of working.
Right. Yeah.
That, you know, just one sort of people who are out snooping around, and that sounds an appalling thing, but snooping around trying to find contraband, if you like, and the others are being forensic, going through tax figures.
Yeah.
So how do you create a culture that allows both to respect each other? And it's that respect thing that is most important, I think, more than anything. It's recognizing the value that each party brings, and why the two of them, which is where this idea of a future story is so powerful. Yeah. Because what's it going to feel like afterwards?
Yeah, very powerful. Paul Corney, thank you again for coming back to do part 2 of this. I'm sure there'll be part 3s and part 4s. I'm hoping there will be anyway.
Okay.
And again, they can, if people want to get in touch with you, they can find you at Knowledge et al. And I'll put
knowledgeetal.com. Yeah.
Paul, thank you very much for coming back, and I hope to speak to you again very, very soon.
Okay, delighted.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul. Bye-bye. So that was Paul Corney from Knowledge et al. And if you want to see more from Paul, you can go to his website at knowledgeetal.com. And this is Kenny Goodman from findtheedge.com. I'll speak to you again soon.